All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending How to Control the Chaos of Bank Account Management. We are really excited to talk to you today about Redbridge and how you can control the chaos of bank account management. Just a quick note on how today's webinar will go. There will be a brief Q&A at the end of today's presentation. So if you do have questions, please feel free as we go along to submit them through the questions function found in your control panel, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Before we move on, we have a quick 2-question poll that we would like you to participate in. So here is the first question. You'll have about 30 seconds to enter your answer. Okay. All right. Close this poll. And here is the next question. All right. Close the poll here, give it one more second. All right. So there are the results to question 1.
Nate.
And one more. Well, very interesting results. That's almost exactly what we expected to see. To that end, I'd like to turn it over to your presenter for today, Redbridge Analytics Senior Director, Dan Gill.
Thank you much. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to spend a little time with you today talking about one of my favorite topics in all of Treasury, and that is bank account management. One of those little side chores that kind of annoys most of us, but we have to do it. And in many companies, what we found that to be is a completely chaotic process and very uncontrolled. And so we're going to try to get around some ideas of how we can better control that, some philosophies and methods that we've developed for gaining effective controls around bank accounts and things. And then I'll show you a little bit of our specific approach, Hawkeye BAM, to solve the problems of bank account management. So my name's Dan Gill. I have spent the past 25 years in Treasury in a very specific niche of the Treasury world, focusing mostly on bank fee management, bank fee analysis, bank account management. In that time, I've worked with hundreds of different organizations trying to help them establish effective controls and efficiencies around their inventory of bank accounts. Most companies, as we just saw in our poll, are trying to use a patchwork of spreadsheets and homegrown databases to manage BAM information. Most of them are ineffective, at least partially, and that leaves the organization at risk It leaves us at risk, and that's something that we really need to focus on in order to do it. It's not because people are inept at what they're trying to do. It is just that there is so much complexity to keeping track of all of these things, to synchronizing these things with their banks, and to doing it the specific ways that each organization wants to do it, that really makes it a challenge. So over the years, I've helped build several different bank account management solutions for different vendors, and we end up in the same place frequently. We end up with a BAM system that whatever the vendor thinks is the way things should be done is the way they are done. And what we've set out to do, and what I'm going to talk about today, is a new framework of thinking of how to solve the problem of BAM and building a solution or a framework that will allow us to customize to any organization without having the massive cost of trying to build something on your own. In the end, your company has to have a bank account management solution. You just have to be doing something. And like we saw in the poll, most people are trying to do it in spreadsheets or an Access database. But we need to come up with better ways of not only thinking of this, but also in managing the problems. So what are we trying to solve? For the purpose of this demo, I'm going to pretend as if I am the treasurer of a large corporate known as Acme Inc. I have about 800 bank accounts all over the world at banks in lots of different locations. In my case, my CFO is pretty scared of Sarbanes-Oxley, especially the fact that he has to sign his name on the financials, and I'm accountable for the bank account management. So I need to think of how I'm going to do all of this. Now, there's countless examples in recent years of companies that have had significant fraud events or had loss of controls, or they have audit results that are not what they would desire. The world is a dangerous place, and as time goes on, that danger increases and it's getting faster. These dangers have seen all sorts of regulatory actions like Sarbanes-Oxley, what we see with KYC from different banks in different parts of the world, even one of my favorites that destroys my whole team once a year, FBAR. So there's a lot of concerns in this and things that are tangential to bank account management that we have to solve. The globalization of my company and many of yours leads to a number of additional things. The problems of money laundering and terrorism have brought different things that we now have to deal with. I need to be able to have a way to codify and to store all of this information so that I can maintain good, accurate records of every account that we have and all of the related elements of those accounts. In my company, and in many of companies that are on here today, we have hundreds of bank accounts around the world. I know of a number of companies that in a given month, they'll open and close several hundred different bank accounts. And so if you think about just the sheer volume of the information and all of the changes that go on to that information, it's why there's so many challenges to solving this problem. So let's think about a framework of how we can approach this in a new way, right? So it boils down to me to this idea of balancing the risk, and I'm going to talk about account risk and control in a minute, but balancing the risk that we're trying to mitigate or eliminate if we can, and efficiency. Right. One of the big things that I've seen in organizations that really go all in and trying to solve this is that they build such tight frameworks and tight controls that there's so many rules to follow and so many processes to try to get done that the humans, the people in Treasury, can't possibly get them done. So I have to build effective controls. If I'm going to ward off fraud, if I'm going to be able to achieve compliance with the regulatory items and my auditors and things like that, I really have no choice but to figure out a way to create or to control all of the chaos that goes around just tracking this massive information. So I've met few Treasury teams that have excess capacity, though, to really make that happen. In fact, I don't know of any Treasury team that's sitting there looking for extra things to do. So if we don't balance that with efficiency, If we don't balance that with the fact that somebody or some tool is going to have to be able to manage this, I'm going to be in big trouble, and my controls will never be effective because I won't be able to follow them. So let's talk about an idea that I like to use called containers, right? So BAM is a little different than many Treasury systems, right? Most Treasury systems are giant number crunching machines that take data in and push data out and do giant calculations. Bank account management isn't really like that at all. It is about the tracking of information and keeping very detailed, very controlled records of things. And so I like to describe the problem or how we're going to solve the problem by thinking of all of the data I have of my bank accounts as a bucket or a container, right? And you may be able to think of a lot of different types of containers. I was lucky enough to just go to a conference this week, and it was the first time I traveled in 2 years. And back to the expense management and things like that. And you're going around and you get an Uber and you get these receipts and you're shoving them in your wallet, and then you got to figure it all out in the end. Or I've got boxes all over the place. And so this idea of containers is a good way to think of how we're going to store and organize the information. So what do we need to think of when it comes to containers? Well, first of all, who owns the container, right? So if I think of my bank accounts as being a folder full of different pieces of information, well, who owns the master record of that folder? How many copies are there of that container? Who's got the master copy? Who's got a synchronized copy? And how do I keep those in order? How easy is it for me to look into a container and find what I need? How secure is it? Right? All of these different things come from however I decide I'm going to store and hold on and save this information. My choice can be anything from sticky notes all over my computer monitor to piles of paper to boxes that go all over the office that aren't really much help to me when I'm working from home, to a vault that nobody knows the combination to a ship that sailed around the world and I can't even find it. So I like this idea of the container analogy because a lot of what we're going to talk about as we dive into bank account management is this idea of how do I manage and effectively control all of the information that gets into bank account management. So let's touch a little bit on risk, right? A lot of what is BAM comes from the idea of controlling risk. We know that there are many forces in the world that would love nothing more than to get into these containers that are our bank accounts so they can remove the contents, especially if they can do it without your knowing, or even better, get into the container that you don't even know you have. Right? So when I think of every bank account as this container that holds the company's most liquid assets, I need to have ways not only to protect the container itself, but to know where all the containers are and how they're organized. So every single bank account I have, one way of thinking of it is that it's a source of risk. Every bank account is a portal into my cash management, into our cash holdings. And if I don't protect those properly, then they can be open to outsiders that I don't want in there. And of course, then we have employees throughout the organization that have some level of authority over those bank accounts, that they can release wire transfers, they can sign checks, they can send out batch ACHs. Maybe they just have access to the bank's portal. But the idea is that I have employees who are authorized or entitled to do things with the company's accounts. And so obviously there's a source of risk there that I also need to control. Unfortunately, I'm not the person that's in charge of the employees. I don't even know who all the employees are, and I need a way to know those that have entitlements. And then, of course, every single one of those accounts generates costs for my organization. So I need to be thinking of that as I'm looking at this. So let's boil it down to some of the challenges that I found in my company, my little company that I am the treasurer for. How many accounts do I have that are out there that I don't know about, right? Either because I have a process that allows accounts to be open in the field that Treasury isn't either a part of or even notified for, right? Those are perhaps the most vulnerable accounts. I end up with too much information in too many places. How many of us have had an acquisition where we bring on another 150 bank accounts, 200 bank accounts that were opened by a different organization that I may or may not know everything to. And so this container idea becomes very difficult to control with all of the moving parts that happen in the course of business. And so I need to be able to figure out and find and know and have processes to control all of those. Now, how many people do I have with signers? And you'll hear me use this term signers or authority holder or mandate holder. We're talking about employees that have authority to spend the company's money out of these accounts. How many signers do I have today that are no longer at the company? How do I find out when someone leaves the company that is an authorized signer? If I can't do that, how do I possibly say that I have my accounts under my control? How can I possibly sign off that my financials are real and accurate when I don't even know what bank accounts I have or which people are authorized to spend money on them? I need some way to control those employees and how they do things and their authorities. How do I control against fraudulent activities against those accounts? Right? Do I have positive pay on all my disbursement accounts, debit blocks or filters on all of my accounts to make sure that people can't simply reach in and take money out without my authority? There are tools that most banks offer us that give us ways. How do I know that I have all those in place when I have 800 bank accounts or 8,000 bank accounts? I need ways that don't require a human to go through it and see it. And then finally, something I'm going to spend a good bit of time on during this is, how do I know that the bank's records match mine? Perhaps one of the greatest challenges in this whole thing is, how do I get the bank's records to match mine? So let's develop a bit of a process, a way of breaking this down into bite-sized chunks that we can look at, a flow that we can go through to help get my bank accounts well managed. So I break it into these 4 areas of risk control, if you will. First of all, there's organizational risk, there's account control risk, there's transaction risk, then there's processes. So I start when I visit a company, I start by looking at how they're organized. And the first thing I try to decipher is, what is their tolerance for risk? So different companies, even in the same industry, have different levels of things that risks they are willing to take. And different people, different CFOs, different treasurers have different approaches to that. And one of the things I have to understand is, what is the tolerance of risk? How's the company organized? Is it global or is it domestic? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? What kind of relationship structure are we required to have from a legal or tax perspective? What's our short-term and long-term funding and capital requirements? So how do all of these things work together to understand what types of accounts do I need? How many do I need? Where do I need them? Tied to what business unit, what legal requirements, et cetera. And I need to understand my organization and how all of that needs to work. Then I start looking at the accounts themselves to make sure that my treasury team has control over all of our bank accounts. Now that can be different based on how our treasury works. If there's a single central treasury, or if we have multiple treasury centers around the world with no central view. So how do I go through? How do I rationalize that I have the right account structures, that I'm using the right types of accounts in the right places? Can I close accounts? Can I eliminate accounts? How are my funding structures set up? My concentration structures, my pooling structures, all of the ways that I take cash and distribute it where it needs so that I can deploy it appropriately. What kind of monitoring tools do I have in place? What kind of things can I see on the accounts to know balance information or access information and things like that? Do I have good processes? How do I audit the fees? How do I know the KYC requirements in the different banks in the various countries that I deal with? So I need to come up with ways to manage and control all of the things around the bank accounts themselves. Transaction controls then get to, how am I managing the day-to-day activities, right? Do I have positive pay in place on all the bank accounts that I draw disbursements from. And that sounds like a great control. The problem is, how am I ever going to be able to check that? And that's one of the ways that I take account analysis statements, fee statements, and use those as a control point, because I'm able to query what I'm seeing on each bank account to tell whether or not positive pay or debit blocks or filters or the right controls or the sufficient IT controls to guard all of those things are in place. And so it's actually kind of a novel way of looking at this with fee statements as a compensating control to make sure I have all those things in place. And then I need to start looking at my processes, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time today. How do I manage the inventory of accounts, right? I use this term inventory of accounts. It's just this idea of the container of all of the different account containers. It's an inventory, and if we think of it like an inventory, it gives us some ways to picture this. How do I manage the people who are mandate holders or signatories or authority holders, right? Those employees that have authority. One of the biggest challenges in some companies, and there's a number of very novel ways of thinking of that and looking at it. How do I make sure I'm communicating both internally with systems that are connected to bank account management, but how do I make sure that I'm able to communicate data back and forth? And then finally, how do I synchronize that information with my banks going forward? So a lot of different things I can do. I can sit here all day long and I can come up with hundreds and hundreds of controls or rules or procedures that I'm going to follow or have my team follow. But if I don't balance that against the idea of efficiency, I'm going to quickly end up building myself a system or a process that just paralyzes everything. So I have to balance efficiency with my controls. Fraud and risk are certainly some of the greatest challenges that we face, but focusing only on those aspects are going to create paralyzing situations. And so we have to keep in mind the fact that this is going to be work that in some cases people are going to have to do. We're going to automate it wherever we can, but I have to be able to balance controls with the ability to comply with them. So that leads to this idea of bank account management. And what the heck is that? The idea of effectively managing bank accounts has been around in some form since the advent of the paper check, when people were fraudulently signing checks, fraudulently drawing checks, doing all sorts of things and just passing checks off on legitimate accounts and taking money out of the accounts. And in the 1960s, we invented something that is still with us, unfortunately, in some ways today, this idea of a signer card, where we would have a sample of every person's signature who's going to sign checks, and then theoretically the bank would check to see if the signature matches when they got a check. And that was an attempt at controlling this fraud risk of checks. And the concept of using a database or some sort of spreadsheet or something for bank account management, it really began in the 1990s as companies were expanding and the number of bank accounts check signers grew. Some of us were in Treasury in the 90s during a time when we talked more about a thing called remote disbursement instead of remote deposit that we talk about today, or some of the more fancy things. Times were a little different, but the general thing or the problem remained the same. Since then, a lot has changed. A lot of things have impacted us. 9/11. We saw the banks when airplanes couldn't fly, we saw all sorts of breakdown in check processing, and that brought us Check 21, and then anti-money laundering requirements and combating the funding of terrorism, and that led to things like KYC and the Patriot Act, which ultimately brought us to a point of thinking about things like FBAR. And so the past 20 years have really brought a lot of change in this idea of fraud control your accounts, know who's accessing them, and things like that. Of course, then we had scandals in places like Enron, Parmalat, Tyco, WorldCom, a variety of others that at least had some elements that centralized around this idea of loss of control of the bank accounts, not knowing that you had accounts in one place or another, or not tracking that you had accounts in one place or another, or people opening accounts that were not authorized and then siphoning money out of the company. Of course, then the 2008 financial crisis hit. We realized that counterparty risk was a far bigger thing than we ever thought it was. We had a massive liquidity crisis, and things changed quite a bit, which brought us things like Dodd-Frank and other regulations that now we all have to comply with. And the regulations just keep piling up. And now here we sit giving webinars from home in COVID. And none of us could have seen anything like what the past year and a half have been like from just trying to manage all of the things of Treasury in an environment that we never pictured. And all of those sticky notes that I have on my computer monitor at the office telling me about who's the signer on this account or that account, I don't have access to because I'm working from home. And it puts me in an environment that's very difficult to manage and handle. So what is bank account management? Let's talk about and let's define it before we dive in and start breaking it up. In 2008, I was a part of a group that was working to harmonize and promote what was then the newly developed Swift EBAM capabilities. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute, but the idea was that it would change the way that corporates communicated account and signatory changes with their banks. And EBAM, which is a method of passing files back and forth between your corporate treasury and your banks in order to do 5 specific things like open accounts, close accounts, change signers, etc. It was a way of passing files back and forth so you could have a conversation of sorts. But when that group got together, one of the first things that we realized was if you ask 5 people, what does bank account management mean? You'll get 7 answers. And so one of the first things we did was to try to set out and define the term. And this is the definition that we came up with that I still use today. Bank account management is the policies, the procedures, the actions to open, close, and modify the bank accounts that you have with your financial institutions. Now, this includes the negotiation and management of account services and fees, because not only is managing that cost important, but also we can use that from a fraud control point of view and something that we can monitor for controls. The mandates, those legal documents that govern the bank accounts, the authorized users, those people, those the employees that can spend the money on the bank account, the methods of communication regarding those activities back and forth with the banks, managing the interrelationships among the accounts, whether that's pooling structures, funding structures, relationship structures, how they work together, how you concentrate your money and how you get cash to where you can deploy it, and then regulatory reporting and compliance. And so that all lays out the framework of what we're going to look at here now. So let's talk about my house, my bank account management house, right? This is what it's like in my fictitious company. Right? My BAM house is supported with various spreadsheets of semi-accurate information about some of the company's bank accounts, a few other spreadsheets, a couple of homegrown Access database. Some of them store some kind of recent information about the employees that have authority over the accounts, but in general, it's all over the place. And this is because I've acquired companies. This is because I've opened new regions, because I'm partially centralized, partially decentralized, and I know that's very common in many of your organizations as well. I've just got information everywhere. So if someone's going to ask me if all of my accounts are under control, well, sort of, in some place. And then, of course, we've developed a number of policies and procedures that we're supposed to follow for opening and closing bank accounts and making changes to them. And I'd really like an automated way to enforce those policies and make sure that people followed all the right steps, but that just piles up. Of course, I would really like to try to communicate my changes to my banks, but in my last audit, the internal auditors found 12 bank accounts that I was sure were closed, but were still open at the bank. We do our best to meet our SOX 404 requirements, and FBAR alone has just become a mind-numbing grind every single year. I'm constantly having audit problems, and it just consumes more and more of my time and costs me more and more sleep. All the while, I know there are those out there that would love to get into my accounts so that they can start siphoning money or committing fraud. So what am I going to do about this? Well, what we did to solve this problem is we developed this idea of a 4-pillar system to support my house in a far better way. And so these 4 pillars are the keys to how I explain things. And the first pillar is what I refer to as the accurate system of record, or you'll hear me talk about the perfect database. This is detailed records about anything about my bank accounts and the related elements, completely tailored to my organization or to your organization. On the other side, the reason we need to do all this is because we need to demonstrate compliance, we need to demonstrate control, we need to show that we have a good handle on the true inventory of the bank accounts, everything about them, who they belong to, and who is authorized to spend money on them. We need to be able to comply with things like FBAR. We need to deal with all of these different KYC requirements of all these different banks in different countries. And so that sort of supports the other side of the house. I also need a way to efficiently and quickly manage and provision my policies and procedures. So I need detailed process workflows, right? A procedure is a series of steps to, let's say, open a bank account. I need a central way to design workflows that match my policies and procedures that then gives me control, audit, record keeping, and all of the information I could want to have around my audit and my workflows. And then my final pillar, what I think is one of the most important and still one of the biggest challenges, is this idea of bank synchronization. And how am I going to make sure that my records, that perfect database from pillar 1, is synchronized and matches what my banks say they do. So let's look at those really quick. BAM is a lot more than just knowing your bank accounts, right? There's all of these containers, again, to keep using that analogy. It centers around all the bank accounts that the company has. Now, these may be centralized, they may be decentralized, they may be regional. There can be a lot of different ways that those are organized, but here's the idea of my bank accounts, right? So here's all my bank accounts, and of course I need to track the information about the banks and the branches that those banks are at, right? Consider each one of these one of those containers I was talking about. Of course, the corporate structure comes into this because those bank accounts are owned by part of the organization, a subsidiary or the parent company, or however the company's organized. And so I need all the legal structure information and those account resolutions, the legal documents that get into all of this. I have those authority holders, those signers, employees that have authority. I need to track all of those and their relationship to the bank account. The contacts that I deal with at each of my banks, I need to know who I can call for what situation, and I need all of that in a centralized location. I need to match those account interrelationships, my pooling structures and funding structures and things like that. All of these boil down to a bunch of different data containers that are interlinked with each other that I can look at. I need to know where I have the appropriate transaction controls, positive pay and things like that. And how do I get there? I get there by using bank fee analysis to look at the fee statements to make sure I can spot check or automatically check that all those things are in place. And then, of course, KYC is the headache of the year, well, maybe the decade. I have to figure out how am I going to communicate the right information to each of my banks to get them to do what I need them to do for opening accounts, changing signers, etc. And this is sort of the core view of BAM. Now, I also have all of these outside systems like legal and HR and IT and the KYC registry, for instance. Swift is working on a cool solution for that, bank fee analysis and things like that. I need to be able to link then my BAM information to outside systems to look at it even deeper. So that's the data. That's the perfect database. Once I've got it established, I've got a place for every single thing that I track, every field of data that I have in all of those spreadsheets that are currently spread all over the place. Anything that I could want to store customized to my view. Then I need to be able to control what happens when it changes, right? When I need to open a new account or close an account or add a signer or remove a signer. And for that, I probably have at least some procedures or policies in place today, but it's only followed by the fact that people go down and do a checklist on a piece of paper. And so what I need is a complete workflow engine that takes my policies, right? Not the policies Redbridge tells you have to follow to open a bank account, but my policies, and codifies them into a workflow that lets me go from all the steps that I need to happen to gather the information that I need, to take the different pieces and gather them together, to get the right approvals, to notify the right people, and to finally execute on that information. And so workflows are critical, but they have to be customizable. Otherwise, they're just going to make it harder for you to do what you're trying to do. And synchronizing with the banks, what I call pillar 3. And this is different than the terminology that we've typically used in the BAM space, but I think it's a better accurate description. Today, when I want to open an account or close an account or change a signer, it's a very slow, very inefficient way of passing them documents, passing from Treasury to the bank documents, identification information. It's different at every bank. Lots of different things I have to deal with, and it's very slow, and I have no idea whether they actually did it. And honestly, it's still about the same way we did it in 1980. And we need to improve from that. And many of you have probably heard of the idea of Swift's EBAM, which came out around 2010, and has made some good headway in giving automated ways not only to communicate changes and include the files necessary to affect those changes, but also to get an automated response back from the bank that, yes, we got it, and yes, we did what you asked, right? And that was a great step forward. But it's an idea of let's pass files back and forth to each other on a network, which was fascinatingly cool in 2010. But in 2021, we've kind of gone a little beyond the idea of let's pass files back and forth today. And if you've been paying attention to anything in Treasury, API is all the rage, right? You can't have a webinar and not say API. And so the idea is that I've talked with at least 3 banks in the past couple months who are working on API technologies that will allow systems like I'm going to show you here to communicate back and forth with the banks in a straight through automated real-time way to affect changes, even to transmit documents in some cases, so that I can open and close accounts in a much more easy and efficient way. And where I think this is probably going in the future is another really cool buzzword, and that's a blockchain. Blockchain gets a lot of confusing news about it, but think of it this way. It's one container full of the bank accounts that different parties can look at in the same way. So when a bank is looking at my inventory of bank accounts, they're actually seeing the same thing as I see when I look at it, not just a copy of it, right? And that idea of a shared register, I think, will be very cool in this space. Unfortunately, it's probably 5 years out before we see any banks really starting to adopt that, but it really makes a lot of sense from getting into that pillar 3 stuff. So I talked about workflows, and a workflow is sort of a process triggered by an individual that then has a flow of steps that goes through it that then is executed. But what if we could have robots doing some of that for us? Right? What if instead of a person triggering add a new signer request, what if I had a robot that was sitting there and watching inside this container of all the bank accounts I had and watched for different things to trigger a flow of work, a procedure based on an observation, right? In my company, I have a policy that every disbursement account is required to have at least 3 check signers assigned to it. Well, that's a great policy and a great control. The problem is as people come and people go, how is anyone going to have the time to go and check and make sure that every account still has 3 on that? So in my company, I actually have a way that says, hey, there's less than 3 accounts, and it automatically triggers a workflow that comes to the person and notifies them, add a new signer, and it follows through that process. I can do that for any number of things. I use this actually to also track when an employee leaves my company, which Treasury usually doesn't find out about that unless they've set something up with HR or IT. In my company, I get a list every week of all of the email addresses that were terminated. My Hawkeye BAM system finds those, and I can terminate those by generating a workflow for any matches that I have of people that have authority over those bank accounts. So thinking of workflows and thinking of synchronization in a way that is beyond just looking at that. And of course, it all comes together with this 4th pillar. The reason we're doing most of these things is to have effective control so that when the auditors show up, my life isn't painful. So I can have a good sense that we're following all of the required compliance elements so that when it's time to do our FBARs, I can click a button instead of pull my hair out. So that when I want to communicate a new bank account to one of my banks somewhere out in the field, I can do it because I already know what their KYC requirements are. That's what brings all of this together and why we're trying to approach it in this new way. So with that framework, I'd like to touch on and give you an introduction to Redbridge Analytics Hawkeye BAM application. It's really more than an application because we take this whole new view of how to manage this that is not something that we have done in the industry in the past. Brand new, modern, browser-based, SaaS-delivered, fully customizable, secure framework for solving your BAM challenges. And I refer to it as a framework because it's designed not to give you Redbridge version of bank account management. It's designed to give you the power and flexibility and customization to manage BAM your way, not the way we're going to force on you, without the massive expense that it would take you to actually have somebody build a completely custom system for you. It is the next generation. And so I'd like to just show you a few of the things of how everything works in Hawkeye BAM. So first is that it's completely customizable. The framework of Hawkeye BAM actually comes with all of the elements in a way that I can customize every piece. So every single field I want to track about a bank account, I get to decide what it is and how it's labeled and how it looks. Totally built for you. Right? Completely customizable. And when we build out the system for you, we actually take all of those spreadsheets and all that information you have, which if you think about it is just a bunch of fields, and we build out the system not only to have the information using your language, but also laid out and looking the way that you want your users to experience bank account management as we go. So let's look at a few other things. So we break this idea, those containers, that container analogy that I've been using, we break those up and we call them elements, right? So in anyone who's doing bank account management, there are certain things that are, let's just call them standard elements, right? I need to have information about every bank I have a relationship with, every branch I have a relationship with. And it's just very important to have all that organized, all the accounts, the subsidiaries or companies, those employees that have some authority, my contacts at my bank. Let's just call this the generic BAM elements. Then I also need to be able to store all kinds of different files, right? Supporting documents, whether those are account resolutions or information about signers or any kinds of documents or contracts with the banks. I need a centralized location to store those so that they're not just stacked up in the office all over the place. So I digitize those and they're stored here and attached to the appropriate elements. And so that's very important because it takes everything and it centralizes it into one place. Even if I have a decentralized treasury with treasury centers around the world, I can have both regional as well as central control and views of the entire company if I desire. And so that's an important way to store all of this information. Now, of course, if you've seen Redbridge software before, you know that we love our dashboards to do different things. And so each user can have different tiles on their dashboard to look at different things and see different parts. I have one that's showing me some aggregated information of opens and closes, some that are tracking different workflows that are going on, different users who have left the company, who have entitlement changes going on. These are just workflows, and that's based on my role in doing all of this. So let's look at what it does from how the user experiences this as well. Along with the generic elements, I also have the ability to have an unlimited number of what I just like to call dynamic elements, right? And a dynamic element means it's one that you made up, right? So in my company here, right, I have a lot of retail locations, and those retail locations are served by armored couriers. So I have a place where I track all of my information about my armored couriers. In fact, I have another place where I store all of the information about each courier route, just because I like that. I have places where I can store all of the different authorities, right? Employees that have different types of authorities. Like here's one for all my check signers that takes the employees and links them to the bank accounts with whatever parameters. You know, Dan is authorized to sign a check up to $10,000 on these 40 bank accounts, right? And it ties all of these things together in a way that we refer to as authorities. So it's taking those containers and actually building links between them. But the sky's the limit of what you can do in these. So for instance, I also have lockboxes that deposit into my accounts. I would love a place to store every piece of information about every lockbox and which account it feeds into. I have a lot of merchant IDs or store locations that get into my payment card acceptance. I would love to have a place where I store and have a library of all those. So I created a dynamic element. I use virtual accounts, and really I can come up with all sorts of different dynamic elements, which are simply containers to hold a specific type of information with all of the fields that are important to you, defined by you, and gives me a perfect view into this. And so dynamic elements are very important to making the system custom to you. Because again, it's not forcing you on what did Redbridge think of, but what do you need to store in your organization? Now, along with that, I have the ability to come in and I can build those customized workflows, designs that are a series of steps, a flow of information that goes through and gets the data gathered, gathers the right files, gets the right approvals, and gives me an entire flow for any event that happens. So if I have one to open a new bank account, I have many to open new bank accounts because I have a different one for each business unit, but it follows the specific flow. And it can be as simple as Dan is the requester and Bridget must approve it. A simple 4eyes workflow, or it can go through and gather pieces of data and gather documents and gather notifications and approvals. A very long process in some companies, depending on what kind of controls they deal with. And I have a record every time that's used, so I can see the entire history of, say, the creation of a bank account, and that, yes, it was approved, here's who requested it, here's what day everything happened. And when I show things like that to my auditors, I get very good results because it's clear that I have good controls around this while also maintaining the ease of use and efficiency of not having to remember how to do all these things. And then I talked about those links before, right? So this idea of customized links, there are systems that are upstream and downstream of the bank account management database, right? That perfect database I talked about. And I need to be able to share data, in some cases push data to a system, in other cases pull data from a system, so that places that Treasury doesn't control, like the list of total employees, can be shared and synchronized so that I'm notified when someone leaves the company, and so that I'm able to see what went on. So this idea of linking, whether that's file transfers or someday we'll be talking about APIs pushing out to the TMS system, or we'll be talking about APIs pushing out to the bank. This idea of linking everything together is very important to this approach. So this idea of communication, this is just a slide kind of what I just talked about, but in my organization, here's corporate treasury with Hawkeye BAM. Hawkeye BAM is the system of record for bank accounts in most organizations, which means other systems that have bank accounts need to be fed from it. So I can feed to my ERP when an account opens or closes. I can get feeds from human resources or IT when people leave the company or change roles that might affect this. I can have accesses that my auditors can quickly and easily come in and see the information so that they leave quickly with no findings. I can do things like communicate the information for FBAR reporting, depending on how I handle that. It is a BAM problem to solve. What are my foreign bank accounts and what US people have authority over those accounts? And so I need ways to communicate that out. And then, of course, synchronizing the information back and forth with my banks, which really depends on our banks cooperating, right? We need our banks to be willing to follow more modern methods that will get to this idea of synchronization. And that's why I use this term, is because we're not just talking about, I want to send you some data that'll get stacked up on someone's desk. No, I really am trying to synchronize information with the bank. And that's why I like where things are going with APIs and so on. So what's it like for a user to use the system? Well, when they go in, they can browse through the system, and now I'm just a normal user, and you're going to see throughout the system that we have these grids that show me the information. And these grids are very important because it makes it easy to use and find things without requiring a PhD in bank account management, right? Because we've gotten a little into the weeds, and we don't want our users who just want to know what's the bank account that I should use in Mexico to request this check from, right? I need quick and easy ways to find things. So these grids give me easy ways to sort, filter, group things, and even save views of what I'm doing. So I'm looking at my banks here, and this is just my normal, what I call the bank view. But I have another one that bases the banks and shows me filters and sorts based on my counterparty risk for each bank. I have another one that gives me the KYC information for each bank. So it's an easy way to gather information, something I call reporting from anywhere, to get data, to be able to look at it, to be able to find it quickly and easily, and even click a button and get it out in a report as a spreadsheet or something that I want to be able to look at in print or email or do whatever. So finding the information, reporting on the information in an intuitive way is what makes Hawkeye BAM easy for people, even who are experiencing it outside of Treasury, to understand what they're seeing and doing. And so let's look at a couple of other things that I have. I'm going to look at my bank accounts, and I'm going to actually go in and show what some of the screens look like so you can get this feel of how things are customized and how they go. So you have an example of my grids, right? This is looking at bank accounts at this point, and you'll notice this one is grouped to show me my accounts by branch, and so I can look and see at what I want. And not only does this give me reporting, but I simply come in and I can click and I can see the particular account I selected. Now, this gets back to where I talked about the customization of everything. Every single one of these fields on this screen came from information in my company. And during setup, during implementation, we took all that data that was all over the place in those spreadsheet and access databases, and we identified all the different fields, and then we brought them in here. But everything from the way the fields are labeled to how they're laid out, to their size, to the data constraints on them, to the fact that this screen is yellow, I decided. Redbridge didn't decide that. Redbridge doesn't force you to do any of the things our way. We give you the ability to take your data and have it look the way you want your users to experience it. It's these fields, put in these tiles, laid out the way you want it. I can look at them in different ways. Here's some different classifications I've put on all my different accounts. Here's some ownership information of what company owns it, what the parent company of that is, and a lot of just different ways that I can look at and see things. Now the screens are based on tabs as well, so I can click on a different tab and I can go in and I can see here's a tab that has all my FBAR information for this particular bank account. Yes, it's a foreign bank account. I'm getting a feed from outside of the maximum balance for a year, which is one of the things I need to report FBAR things. And so I have places to store all that. And I also have places where I can store and build those links I described before. So in this case, I'm looking at all of the merchant IDs, my store locations that deposit into this account. And this could also be those authorities I talked about. I also have a place to link all of the lock boxes that deposit into this account. Now remember, those were completely dynamic elements that I decided to build out, that I set up during implementation, so that I have all of the linkages and these associations between different things quick and easy to see. So that's the really high level of Hawkeye BAM. Thanks for watching that. Let me jump into some of the accounts. Let's see. Well, the first one, will we get the slide deck? Yes, we will. You're going to actually see you'll get an email that will have a link where we'll have not only the recording of it, but we'll also have access to the slide deck. And my email address is right here. I love talking about this stuff. If you guys want to have any other questions, feel free to ask me. Slide deck. Can we have a workflow where users request access to bank accounts through a form or site open to employees? And the answer is yes. It's that idea that I talked about of triggers. And so there's a couple ways to accomplish that. In some companies, Hawkeye BAM is distributed near enterprise-wide, I would call it, to where there are some users who actually have a login to Hawkeye BAM if that's what you wanted, but the only real thing they can do on it is click a button that says request new bank account. There are other ways coming that are the ability to give an email way to trigger a workflow that starts off in Hawkeye BAM, even for a user that may not have direct access. So yeah, we can do a lot of different ways to do that sort of trigger, up to and including those robots I talked about that can do some of the automated things. So let's see, next question. We have a requirement to track the requester and the approver of a bank account request. Currently are all managed through a site, a form that tracks the requester and approval. Yeah, so that is in essence what the workflow is doing. So it takes a person usually who triggers something, and then it goes through whatever steps are necessary. And the different steps are things like gathering data, notifying different people, and requiring that someone approves it. And so if you think of a workflow as a chain of steps, it has to pass through the chain in order to get to where it gets executed. And so we can set those up as simply or as complex as they'd like. Let's see. Is the application SSO enabled? Yes, it is. We have the option. We use SAML 2.0 as the framework for that. But yes, it can be single sign-on. How does the system manage international account opening KYC requirements? That is a very good question. So there's a couple ways that we approach that. Right now, I would say we're seeing work in a variety of places, but the one I have my eye on the most is Swift's KYC registry, which is designed to be this library. Our intent would be that when that is up and running, that we would be able to tie into that. So if you think of it, Hawkeye BAM has records for each of the banks, and really this is more about the branches of those banks in specific countries. And we would be able to use APIs that Swift will be building to call and retrieve information from there. In the meantime, one of the things that we've done in several places is we actually gather the information directly from the bank or branch, and we build fields, since I can build an unlimited number of fields, of what are the specific documentation and KYC requirements for each of those banks or branches. And we track it, call it centrally in the system while we're waiting for some of that. And I know I'm answering these kind of quickly in the interest of time, but if you have additional questions, please feel free to either email me, or you're going to get an email from us after this that you can respond to and get the information from there. Yes, my slides will be coming. Yes, we can use an outside site to be able to trigger workflows. We have a requirement to track the requester and the approver of the bank account access request. Okay, that's sort of what I just talked about. Yes, we can track all of those. And let's see. Oh, wow, there's still a few more. Talked about KYC. Can the access be limited by entity and by bank account? So yeah, the idea of those grids, one of the reasons why those grids are in place is that you can control through the security parameters what each user, and it's not even really a user, what each role of people can access. So I can do things like create places where they can only access certain workflows, for instance, or assign which people are able to do the designer things, right? We don't want normal users just going in and changing the way screens look, for instance. So I can control all that, call that the functions, but I can also control what they see from a record point of view. So if I say you can only see the bank accounts that belong to Spacely Sprockets, then your entire experience in the system is going to be filtered down by that, and that's going to give me a way to control and make sure that each person did that. I talked about SWIFT and EBAM. Is that only for SWIFT connected corporates? That's a broader discussion. I break down SWIFT EBAM into two component parts. One of them is files that go back and forth. There's 15 different files that can do 5 different tasks. One way of sending them back and forth, if you're connected to SWIFT for corporates, is over that. But I break it down a little different, and that's why I've really adopted this idea of synchronization, because in 2021, I'm not as convinced that the model of let's pass files back and forth to each other is the best. And so oftentimes there's a handful of banks that do support SWIFT EBAM, but most do not. And so I think we're going to actually see it veering away from that to a certain extent and going to what I might call more modern methods. Now, the SWIFT EBAM effort was still very valuable, because what it did was it got everybody, banks and corporates and vendors, pretty much in agreement of what data needs to pass back and forth. My only question is, does it need to continue to be done by files over a network? So that remains to be seen, and we will be having some updates on that. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you very much for your time today. And we look forward to having a conversation with you directly, and I can show you some more of Hawkeye BAM and how it will directly work in your organization. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day.